Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us for this special May Day discussion of the Communist Culture Club. It's one of the most inspiring subjects I think you can discuss as a communism, which is called the communism of the past and communism of the future. This is based on the understanding that for most of its existence, humanity has actually lived in a very egalitarian way, in very egalitarian communities, what Marx and Engels called Urkommunismus in German, which has been rather badly translated as primitive communism. Much better would be original communism, which gets the idea much better. This is an understanding that an understanding of those communities quickly shows how absurd the idea is that capitalism is either natural or indeed sort of the pinnacle of humanity, the best we can possibly be, and nothing can come after that, and it doesn't get much better than that. Engels in particular wrote about egalitarian societies of our ancestors in his book Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State. He did get a few things wrong, and we'll probably get to this, crucially on the idea that those societies actually suffered from scarcity, when in fact, for hundreds of thousands of years, these societies were dominated by the opposite, by abundance. It's a different kind of abundance that we understand today, or what we are struggling for communism of the future, but it's definitely very much related the way things were and the way we want them to be. And I find that subject extremely inspiring. And I'm very pleased that we have with us two comrades from the Radical Anthropology Group, Camilla Power and Chris Knight, who are going to talk about those issues. So first is Chris, then Camilla, and then we're opening up for questions and contributions from the floor. Thanks for joining, comrades.
So first, Camilla's going to be doing some science, kind of independently of Marxism. And I'm going to be saying a few things about Marxism, and we're hoping that comrades see that they both kind of converge. First of all, it's lovely to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's an honor, especially to start this revolutionary month, the month of fertility, blood, the red flag, and so many marvelous, inspirational parts of human history. Often I come across the idea that Marxism is a science. I understand what's being said there, but I much prefer, and Tina mentioned, of course, Engels' own formulation. And what Engels said is that the more remorselessly and disinterestedly we pursue science, the more it converges with the interests of the workers. So my problem with the idea that Marxism is a science, it can too easily turn around into people saying, well, I'm a Marxist, therefore I don't need to learn a lot because that's scientific already. Actually, it's really very important to study science, in my view. All of us should be able to study, especially when it comes to the critical question, which we anthropologists ask: what does it mean to be human? And there's a sense, of course, in which all of us know what it means to be human, but it really does need to be pursued ruthlessly, disinterestedly, connecting up past and future. There is a chance, possibly a rather remote chance, as things are beginning to turn out right now, there is a chance that humanity has a future. If so, when we get there, we will find some people in some societies, they're already in the future. Because as Tina mentioned, there are societies today which are communist and always have been. And most of the societies which are genuinely communist, including gender egalitarian, fully communist, are groups that we call immediate return. They don't practice storage. And the reason they don't practice storage is because why on earth would you want to store food when you've got abundant resources all around you? And Tina's absolutely correct. If you compare hunters and gatherers with early Neolithic people, early farmers, there's no question that the hunters and gatherers have got a better teeth, higher stature, looking more healthy in all sorts of ways, not stooped. In all sorts of ways, hunter-gatherers really had a magnificent lifestyle, and actually still do. The diet of hunters and gatherers is wonderfully rich, wonderfully varied, all sorts of wonderful forms of honey and meat and so on. And compared with us in the West, actually, the standard of living is higher, not to mention so many other features of hunters and gatherers. So the hunters and gatherers that we know, that Camilla knows, and I know, and especially my comrade and colleague Jerome Lewis know, live in Africa, and they're hunters and gatherers of large game animals living in kind of tropical regions of Africa. How do we put this quickly? Marx argued that the first form of property is the ownership of a man of his wife and children in the monogamous family. And the critical feature of hunters and gatherers, immediate return hunters and gatherers, is what's called bride service. And what that means is that a young man coming of age and having a relationship, a sexual relationship, he never acquires conjugal rights in a wife. It's as if his service, his work to earn his partner in the eyes of, for example, her relatives, particularly her mother-in-law, it's never completed. It never arrives at a point where he can say, right, I've got rights in my wife, I can have sex with her. He's always going to be earning his keep, if you like. And of course, hunters and gatherers value all the different kinds of food and honey and so on there are, but particularly meat food is valued. And if a young man doesn't prove himself an effective, hardworking, generous, modest as well hunter, he'll soon be told really to go and find somebody else, and he will be told in no uncertain terms by his sweetheart's relatives, but particularly her mother, his own mother-in-law. And that's a critical feature which indicates that what Marx called property doesn't exist. But of course, there's countless other indications that these people are communist. And of course, the most obvious one is what's called demand sharing. So anyone who's got any food, anything useful, honey, whatever it is, others who lack it have just got the right to say, give me some. And they don't even need to say, if you please, sort of pleases and thank yous. Everyone else has a right to take for themselves, obviously in a respectful way, but not, the idea that if you please, you really please give it. It's not in the person who's got the food or anything else which is valuable. It's not his right to say no, actually. So that's absolutely critical. So and perhaps even more significant in some ways is that although we tend to think of hunters and gatherers as small-scale societies, I think that's a very big mistake. You think small scale. Hunters and gatherers have chains of connection. They have connections with one another right across vast landscapes. In Aboriginal Australia, they're called chains of connection, sometimes called song lines. But in Africa, with the Benjeri, these hunter-gatherers of the Congo and in West Africa, they party with each other. They sing together, and the partying connections, the groups of people form a long connection with each other. They stretch across the landscape, so that right across on the other side of the Congo Basin, right over to the east. When Jerome Lewis played them some music, it was the Benjeli's music, but they said, yes, that's our music, we're those people. And it's an extraordinary range of connections, making it from the standpoint of a hunter-gatherer. He or she lives in an enormously wide world. The horizons are absolutely immense. And when you compare this with the horizons of people in most industrial cities over in the West, say here where I live in London, I mean, how many of us have been I've never been in my neighbor's kitchen, not once. And I think most people in the street would say, how often, maybe your kids manage to get into, neighbors' kitchens and see what happens inside their house, but it's actually unusual. So in the areas of our lives where things matter most, where we have our most precious moments, our loving relationships, we are extraordinarily constricted and narrow, very, very small scale, not large scale. And of course, finally, just to say that applies in particular to kinship. So that it's very unusual among hunters and gatherers for a child to have a mother or a father. And by that I mean one mother or one father. As Engels pointed out, but basing himself on Lewis Henry Morgan's work, the very term for mother is most likely to mean mother's sister, but a whole lot of other what we call classificatory mothers. So every child, in principle, has got a very large number of mothers. And although that idea of classificatory kinship or communist ownership, if you like, or communist possession of relationships of children, that was thoroughly discredited, denounced in the beginning of the 20th century by leading anthropologists like Bronislaw Malinowski. He just said it's absurd. The idea that a woman, a child can have more than one mother is completely absurd. It's now understood. I think Camilla might be talking about this, that actually it's collective childcare. It's made us human. It's the fundamental form of cooperation. All of us often talk about how cooperation made us human, but the particular form of cooperation, which essentially made us human, certainly put us on the road to being fully human, was cooperation in that most labor-intensive of tasks, which is looking after a kid. And it was by being able to share that labor with other mothers, with other sisters, that actually made it possible even for us to have our large brains. One of the points that Camilla in particular has been able to make. So now the whole question of primitive communism, although sadly neglected really by most of the Marxist left, paradoxically has been pretty central to debates within sort of among radical movements in recent years, and particularly because of the contributions of David Graeber, a good friend of mine, an activist friend of mine, of course, an anarchist who died in 2020. And I just to get the sort of debates going, let me just read this out, because David Graeber, and it's continued with the book he wrote just before he died with David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. It's almost as if his main problem, the thing he's most hostile to, is the very idea that we were once communists. So I'll just read this out. Our thinking about communism has been dominated by a myth. Once upon a time, humans held all things in common in the Garden of Eden. He's trying to make fun of it all now. During the golden age of Saturn, in Paleolithic hunter-gatherer bands. Then came the fall, as a result of which we are now cursed with divisions of power and private property. The dream was that someday, with the advance of technology and general prosperity, with social revolution or the guidance of the party, we would finally be in a position to put things back, to restore common ownership and common management of collective resources. Throughout the last 2 centuries, communists and anti-communists argued over how plausible this picture was and whether it would be a blessing or a nightmare. But they all agreed on the basic framework. Communism was about collective property. Primitive communism did once exist in the distant past, and someday it might return. And then the last 3 lines, we might call this mythic communism or even epic communism, the story we like to tell ourselves. Since the days of the French Revolution, it has inspired millions, but it has also done enormous damage to humanity. It's high time, I think, to brush the entire argument aside. And more recently in the book, The Dawn of Everything, David Wengrow said this idea must die. The whole of The Dawn of Everything is designed to show or argue that we've always had property. And one of the arguments in The Dawn of Everything is that among hunters and gatherers, some things are sacred. You can mark a person, a woman, as sacred, for example, with her blood. And his argument is that the very idea that you can mark anything as sacred means that private property exists, because it's like when you've got a car, it's your own car, you've got the key to it, no one else has, and it's sort of sacred to you. And I just find that argument absolutely astonishing. as well as all the various other arguments to say that there's no such thing as communism. And in fact, why would you say that this idea that we were once communist is the most dangerous myth? I mean, surely far more dangerous is the idea that private property, the oppression of women and the state are unchangeable features of being human. They've always existed. So, I mean, it's kind of ironic, I suppose, that it's been some anarchists, leading anarchists, who've actually made this into a current issue. What I want to say is that we do need to look a bit more deeply into how communism works. Now, if Engels was correct when he wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, if he was correct in saying that future communism, and he was, of course, thinking of the Iroquois Indians that his teacher, Louis Henry Morgan, had made it familiar to him. If Engels was correct that future communism would be a return on a higher level to the liberty, fraternity, and equality of the Iroquois clan, then what that means is that it means that in working for communism, we haven't, in an important sense, we haven't got to invent anything new. Communism is part of our origins. It's almost part of our nature. We're constructed by communism, and we've got to return to something which when we get there, we will be sort of familiar with. It's where we were to start with. So that's a critically important idea, but we also need to know a little bit more about how communism works, if we are to have any chance of understanding how it might work in the future, which of course is the topic of this evening's discussion. So just one point, and I won't be saying too much more. It's like, how do we envisage a society which is communist, but no one's going to be kind of in charge? And how are we going to make sure that in preserving that system, we don't end up keeping people in order to prevent anything non-communist, anything too individualistic, too competitive, from arising? And what definitely seems to have happened with the revolution which made us human, which is, and perhaps it should be emphasized that Engels was very emphatic. Communism isn't something that monkeys and apes have. He made it very clear in The Origin of the Family that our closest monkey and ape relatives are anything but communist, and their family systems aren't anything to sort of admire. You quite often get a dominant male monopolizing the females and constant battles and conflicts. So he said that if we can learn anything from the social and sexual lives of monkeys and apes, it's only by negation. What happened when we became human reverse those relationships. So clearly Engels was thinking in terms of evolution culminating in revolution. And we in RAG have been spending all these decades trying to work out what happened during that revolution. And what seems to have happened is that women certainly established, but no means no, that they had rights, that they had freedom of sexual choice, and they formed coalitions which made it absolutely clear no one was going to push them around. But having established that and having, if you like, taken power, what didn't happen was that women held on to that power. And we know this really from much more recent studies of hunter-gatherers in Africa. So just really briefly, this is what I'm going to describe is what Morna Finnegan, and one of us within RAG, who's written some beautiful stuff and studied the Benjelli along with Jerome Lewis, she calls it communism in motion. So the point she's making is that communism was never like a fixed state, a system. There was never a time when human beings thought, oh, we've established communism, we can sort of sit back now and enjoy it. Communism was always something that you had to fight for. And the way in which women fought for it was by actually playing with surrendering their power, allowing the men to come back into power, but not letting them go too far before repeating that revolution. So in a way, what happens is that you have a revolution, you take the power, you enjoy the power, you then get a bit bored being on top, being dominant. And so what happens is instead of trying to hold on to that power indefinitely, women have never done that, by the way. Whatever people might say about matriarchal systems, women have never held on to one-sided power under matriarchy and anything like the way that men held on to power under patriarchy. So having enjoyed the power, let go, surrender, let the men take over sufficiently, this is Morna's point, sufficiently to begin to pose a bit of a threat, so that if the men with their ritual, among the Bajeni, it's called a jengi, the men stomp around and show off their power, their muscles, and their capacity as hunters, but also that could be dangerous, of course. At a certain point, the women say, right, that's enough. And what that means is that another revolution can occur. So in order to prevent this playful, if you like, surrender of power, this playful counter-revolution, win the revolution again. And so you have, and this is exactly what happens with the people that we know well, and particularly Jerome Lewis knows well. So the women take power in a ritual called the Goku. They hold on to that power, and it's almost I wouldn't say terrifying, it's kind of playful, but I mean, the women really make themselves raucously provocative and stomp around the whole place and show off their bodies, but teasingly, without allowing men to sort of, men can be actually quite scared, if you like, and it's kind of all laughing and playful, but it's a really powerful demonstration of women's power. And then the women, okay, we've made our point, and then after a few days, it's the men's turn, and they have their ritual called a jengi. So we have this seesaw, this pendulum of power, which in our view was not a monthly thing, not a monthly ritual like May Day or something. It was actually much more likely to have been once a month. I've probably said as much as I need to, just for now, at any rate. I suppose the thing to say is that, yes, I mean, we became human through revolution. And if Engels is right, if the idea of a return on a higher level is correct, what it means is that we've done it once, we should know how to win that revolution. And so for that reason, we should be able to do it again. It's kind of looking grim these days. The chances of our winning a worldwide revolution are looking pretty slim. But whatever that chance is, let's base ourselves on that chance.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure there are some issues that comrades probably haven't heard before, etc., or might have questions about. I have a couple of questions, but I think we'll leave that to later until Camilla has spoken, because that might actually clarify a few issues. So over to you, Camilla. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to, like, on May Day or the day after May Day, be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is how egalitarianism made us the species we are. So I think that translates in hunter-gatherer, real hunter-gatherer life, into a version of communism, anarcho-communism, but it's communism. Okay, so I totally back up Chris, that we need to be scientific about this, and Marx and Engels themselves always celebrated Darwin, so I'm going to be totally Darwinian. And I'm going to share the screen and hope you can see what's there. If I can find it, can I find it? Can I find it? Oh, that one. Are you able to see that? And I'll make it a full screen. Great. Yep. Okay. Let me just type that down here. That's great. Okay. So for Darwinian, that's better. For Darwinian theory, which is a theory of individualistic competition, to try to explain egalitarianism is really quite difficult, because monkeys and apes are not egalitarians at all. They're constantly hustling, they're extremely intelligent animals, they're constantly in some sort of level of competition with each other. But one of the main theories about why monkeys and apes are so specially intelligent is known as Machiavellian intelligence. Some of you might have heard about it as the social brain. That the main problems for these super intelligent animals are other conspecific super intelligent animals. Their own friends and neighbors are their main problems, giving them the most problems in life. So Machiavellian intelligence is the idea that the way you compete to get that little extra bit ahead is by making friends and influencing others through alliances. So use of alliances is how you get that extra edge. So it's a very dialectical theory. You compete, you cooperate in order to compete, and in competing, you're actually needing to cooperate. You've got to develop those skills. Okay, but what this guy, Andy Whiten, who's the main leader in developing Machiavellian intelligence theory with primates over a long period, he, with a student of his, David Erdl, he argued that the way we can explain this extraordinary egalitarianism in hunter-gatherers is through Machiavellian intelligence. You say, the more you get Machiavellian intelligence, the more you're able to make alliances against others, then at a certain point, it kind of does a flip. And at that flip, it becomes really impossible for any single individual to dominate other people, even no matter how strong they are, because the others will always be able to make an alliance against them. So it's about solidarity overcoming brute strength, fundamentally through alliance, through political alliance. And so at a certain point, it just becomes better to not to try to dominate others, but instead to just refuse to be dominated, to just resist anybody telling you what to do, bullying you, exploiting you. So you just resist. You say no to that. And this Erdl and Whiten, David Erdl and Andy Whiten, called counter-dominance. They said this was the typical attitude. And if you looked at hunter-gatherer strategies and behavior, this was the typical attitude that, okay, people, if they could, they might take like an extra share of something. But as soon as anybody else asks them for a piece of that, a piece of that meat, a piece of those berries, or whatever it might be, they just give it, they just share it, demand sharing. So people had a psychology maybe to be selfish, but then as soon as the community got into action, everything kind of leveled out. And this is what we find in actual existing hunter-gatherer groups, that the people just kind of, there's a rough equality because nobody lets themselves get dominated. They resist it by ridicule, by laughter, by anything that will bring down a person who's attempting to be dominant. Now, Andy Whiten went on with this idea that he called deep social mind. And what he envisaged with deep social mind was that on the basis of egalitarianism, it would become really possible to do mutual mind reading, where each individual would allow the other to read their minds. Now, if you think about it, if you've got anybody who's dominant and bullying, you don't want your boss to read your mind. So to do mutual mind reading and develop what's called in psychology intersubjectivity, where each one of us we allow the other to read our mind. You need egalitarianism for that. And he further linked into it development of culture, the transmission of culture, of learning your cultural processes that you need to have. All of this is a kind of bundle: mutual mind reading, egalitarianism, and the ability to transmit culture. Now, he made with David Erdl, he made this little chart, and it's just a sort of hypothesis here. We're going through evolutionary time from back here. This is like early human ancestors, Australopithecines or Homo, early Homo, going through evolutionary time. And this bit is like history. It's like farming, property, capitalism. And this axis is hierarchy. Hierarchy up here with a tendency to egalitarianism. So what he's envisaging, what they're envisaging, is that from great ape ancestry and the ancestry shared with chimps, bonobos, with other hominins, basically we're pretty hierarchical, but that at a certain point, this starts to really slide down and it really rushes down towards egalitarianism. Now, this is the process of our evolution. And right here, and they couldn't really say where is this point? Where exactly are we? This becomes a real bottoming, maxing out, rather, of egalitarianism. It's like a significant egalitarianism before we reach the situation of property and stratification and class society in history. Okay, so that's, but he wasn't able to give dates or anything like that beyond the sort of surmise. Well, I'm going to try and actually do that and give a bit of a framework for how could this really happen. And especially what Andy Whiten hasn't talked about here is gender and how important that is in doing that. So how am I going forward? Oh, it's not going. Oh, yes, it does go forward. Right. Okay, so I'm just going to mention a few features of our bodies and our anatomy and our minds, our psychology, which really couldn't have evolved without egalitarianism. I mean, we just, you know, they're just the evidence in our bodies without this. And one of the major aspects that is a giveaway of our egalitarian past is our cooperative eyes, the make and the shape of our eyes. We have eyes that are just radically different from all the other 200 odd primate species. In the shape, which is this long, elongated almond shape, and in the background of our eyes. So the iris stands against a very clear white sclera. Now, what that does and why these are called cooperative eyes is that anybody who's looking at us, and we humans spend inordinate amount of time checking each other's eyes. Anybody who's looking at us that can see what we're looking at and what we're interested in. And they immediately can begin to use that to find out, you know, to begin to say, oh, what's that you're looking at? Why, you know, why are you interested in that? We can begin to share ideas, share intentions about, you know, what we're interested in the world. And notice that if somebody was a dominating bully, why would we want to do that? You know, we're only interested in doing that if there's relative egalitarianism. By contrast, all these other great apes, and these are young great apes that are shown in these images, chimps and orangs, or bonobos and gorillas, they all have kind of pretty dark eyes with hardly any white showing. And it's as if they're wearing sunglasses. They're like mafia dons. They're not giving anything away in terms of what are they looking at? Are they looking at some juicy piece of fruit over there? And they don't want to show that they've seen something to the others who might be their competitors. So cooperative eyes are utterly critical to all our, you know, communicative and cooperative interactions. And it's impossible to really envisage that they evolved. They may have evolved a long time ago. I'm going to try and work out a probable scenario of just exactly how long ago. And in what context would cooperative eyes have begun to evolve? Well, this is the theory that Chris was talking about regarding collective childcare. The major theory for the evolution of what I'm calling intersubjectivity, which is mutual mind reading, that I want to know, I look into your eyes, I want to know what is your mental state, what emotions are you feeling, and I am mutually letting you know what I'm feeling. And this is something that really monkeys and apes are just not very willing to do. The problem for them is the level of trust in their societies. And there's only rarely that they can achieve that sort of level of trust. the major theory for what would be the context of the evolution of intersubjectivity is by the absolutely brilliant Darwinian, she's a sociobiologist, Sarah Bluffer Hardy, a really sociobiologist, Darwinian anthropologist. This book, Mothers and Others, is simply the very best that you could read of books written about human evolution this century. And her theory is really simple. It's that we alone, out of all the great apes, began to do babysitting. We began to do, it's termed allocare, that a mother who's extremely burdened by a very large brain baby that needs an enormous amount of care and nourishment, that she can actually hand that baby over to someone else and have a bit of a break and do something else for a bit. So babysitting belongs to all human societies. Babysitting also belongs to monkeys. Monkeys will do this, but great apes, they cannot, not even bonobos, none of them. And the key reason they can't do it is that great ape females only live, they've gone to another group. They've migrated from their home group, generally speaking, gone to another group. And that means they do not have related females with them. And for this behavior of handing over a baby to another female, and I'm assuming it's going to be a female in the first place, another female just needs that to be a related female. So this is where we link in famous hypothesis known as grandmother hypothesis. And if you have this matrix, it's like a little matrix of this coalitions of these closely related females, something extraordinary starts to happen. As soon as a mother gives a baby over to her mother, then immediately all those three individuals, the mum, the baby, and the new carer, they're going to have to be looking at each other in a new kind of way. They need to be reading each other's intentions and letting each other know what they feel, what their needs are, what's their mental state, what's their emotional state. So mom is watching out, the new carer who may be her mom. Is that okay? Is the baby okay? Baby's looking back at mom and then looking at the new carer. So we're getting mom, carer kind of taking over each other's roles, and the baby will be communicating its own feelings, her own feelings, what she needs, and the carer will be looking. So immediately there is this two-way process of everybody checking out the mutual feelings between amongst that whole triad. Now, this isn't just going to stay with females. Obviously, it's not, because males are going to start being involved. Men maybe as pair bonds to women, but also brothers of sisters may be part of the connector, the caretaking complex as well. But it's going to be starting in this little triad of mom, baby, and grandma, mother's mother. Okay. So can we then come back onto this chart and say, well, when exactly, what is the evolutionary time we're talking about here when we start going really into this evolution of something very much more egalitarian? And I'm going to say, yes, we can. And it's through a very materialist perspective that, yes, we can. And it's all about the requirements of females, of mothers, in raising very large-brained offspring. So what we're looking at here, it's a little bit complex, the science perhaps, but it's kind of basic. We're looking at the last couple of million years there in terms of the brain capacity, the actual brain size. And I'm comparing what a great ape brain size, a chimpanzee brain size is like, compared to these. All these are particular fossil specimens. They are actual fossils with their cranial capacities. So we've got a whole bunch down here. These are basically early Homo and Australopithecines. So they're bipedal, but they're still got the brain size of great apes. That's pretty much similar. Now, what that means is these guys didn't have help. The mums of these Australopithecines and early Homo, they didn't have help. They were doing it all themselves. That's why they're under what's called a gray ceiling. They just couldn't find enough energy for raising offspring with larger brains. So the brains were kind of constrained. It's a material constraint. But look what's happened. Oh, I'm going back. Sorry. Look what's happened around the 2 million to 1.5 million years ago. There's this huge jump in brain size, which is smashing through the gray ceiling. And what that means is those mothers of these Homo erectus are getting help. There's a serious amount of help. That could be help in terms of energy supplies, with perhaps males starting to be a little bit helpful, bringing some food supplies. But above all, it means their mothers or other close female relatives were the ones who were giving them support. And this is where the collective childcare that Sarah Hrdy is talking about, it has to start, it has to kick in with all the implications that means about evolution of cooperative eyes, intersubjectivity and mutual mind reading, and a whole new trajectory of what's called pro-sociality. So it really begins there, but it's probably not yet going all the way. It's like a beginning step with this stage with Homo erectus twice, because we have another huge, great increase within the last million years, or just a bit over 500,000 years of this brain size. So when I'm just going back, if I can go back, when we're starting to give a beginning phase of the egalitarianism, but we may not have reached this right there, this sort of maximization there by like this stage. It's when we're looking into this last bit of the evolution of the very large human brains that we will start to do that. Now, what I've done here is give an indication of how we could have tracked a moving from dominance relations all the way to egalitarianism. And I'm saying it's going to have a material connection to the energy requirements of those very large brains and female women's foremothers' needs and requirements in raising offspring who grow up to have these adult brain sizes. You've got to remember that the most of the brain size is there by, even a 4-year-old child has the most of the brain size, but a 7-year-old child has almost got an adult brain. So all of that phase of the growing, that growing up for those children, incredibly energy expensive, with the mothers doing a large part of it through breastfeeding and then needing subsequent extra supplies. So our picture then of like the phases of initiating egalitarianism, or what we can talk about as the original forms of communism with early hunter-gatherer ancestors, is really looking at egalitarianism with this period of our speciation as modern humans. So we can put that, where does egalitarianism max out? In relation to our speciation, we become modern humans with our very large brains, already the cooperative eyes kind of coming into place earlier stages, but we become modern humans as a communistic egalitarian species. Let's just look at that on the bigger chart. The blue circles are actual species, are actual specimens of Homo sapiens from the Pleistocene, the earliest modern Homo sapiens, back 300,000, coming up, still brain size increasing. As this phase of our speciation, so it's between about 300,000 to 150,000, this is a kind of filter that we went through for egalitarianism communism, pro-sociality, refusal to be bullied, all the intersubjectivity and the willingness to share our mental states, all of that emerging through this whole period. Now, the other part of it that is the proof, the absolute proof that we had this egalitarian, very long, extended period of egalitarianism in our evolution is quite straightforwardly language itself. There is no way that language could have evolved except in this matrix of egalitarianism. It is an extraordinary, and Chris can say more about this if people want to ask questions about it, but it is an extraordinary system of communication which relies on a level of trust that is almost an infinite level of trust. It demands not just but it demands the maximum of intersubjectivity, of our willingness to read each other's minds and and tell each other about what's in our minds, tell each other our thoughts and our dreams. Chimps, bonobos, they're incredibly clever creatures. Those great apes, as well as other species with great intelligence, with their very sophisticated communication systems, but those communication systems are not linguistic. They always have what are known as reliable signals that are linked to bodily states, bodily and emotional states, by comparison with us. So we can say three things: cooperative eyes, the very large brains, language itself, are all just complete proof that we evolved with this filter during this period of time with an extraordinary level of egalitarianism, involving all these mechanisms that we see with hunter-gatherers, the demand sharing, so nobody can end up with lots more than anybody else, resistance to being bullied, particular use of humor and ridicule to anybody who tries to big themselves up and make themselves out as the most. What I can say towards, I think I've come to the end of my slides. Can I come back? I think I have, so I'll come back there. What can I say to add to Chris about communism of the future? Look, we have evolved human nature through hundreds of thousands of years with these incredible, sophisticated psychological, cognitive capacities that are forged through egalitarianism. You know, none of that. Capitalism is a few hundred years in its lifetime. A few generations in some places in the world, very few generations, that it cannot wipe away overnight. Not even the many generations in farming and more stratified societies cannot wipe away overnight what is our actual evolved nature. David Graeber doesn't always get everything right. I'll absolutely agree with you. And he's not much of a materialist, though he was a good anarchist activist. He did have some very good thoughts about the ways that, in fact, capitalism relies on our communistic nature to even work. It relies, it parasitizes on the facts that we are so cooperative, so willing to help each other, even when, you know, we may be strangers. In any hunter-gatherer camp, same as on the streets of London, we are willing to help total strangers. This isn't heard of in any other animal society, really, that we will just do that. We want to be helpful. It's part of our, you know, it's part of our who we are that we want to be helpful. This doesn't mean, of course, there aren't horrifying political conflicts for all kinds of reasons that we know about as Marxists, but it's in our nature, absolutely. Chris mentioned some of the aspects of, haven't gone into the full-scale model of the solidarity of women's picket lines in, you know, it's from women that resistance to be bullied really starts. It's from those who have the most requirement for energetic support in terms of the children. It's women's and children's strategies that were most counting in evolution. they needed to be able to establish no means no. They needed to be able to establish some things are sacred, okay? And some things are sacred means, as all indigenous people will have understanding of will have cosmology, religion, ritual that preserve that aspect of sacredness. Now, this is a hard thing to say to Marxists, but I just want to pull on, remember Marx's quote about religion as the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions, the opium of the people. So he wasn't making a total negative out of religion at all. In many ways, human beings cannot live. I mean, they really need that soul of the soulless world, especially in capitalism. Establishing some things as sacred for our future on the planet, for caring for this beautiful planet of ours, establishing that some things are sacred to be able to share properly. Our desperate problems on this planet are because there are blind, tiny oligarchic minority who are way too greedy and are not sharing properly. We need to raise that hunter-gatherer tactic of demand sharing. We need to establish some things are sacred, and we need to take the model that Chris was talking about of this communism in motion, which Morna Finnegan especially developed, and put that into action, into realistic or practical action, that we do what hunter-gatherer women do. They come in, they take the space, they resist any attempt by men to bully them or exploit them, say no, but they do it with hilarity, with laughter, with carnival, with showing, teasing the men, but showing how beautiful they are and sharing that in solidarity. It's not any sort of competition amongst the women. And they are using they're using a religious or cosmological framework which links particularly to their bodies and to the moon. Now, if you think of every religion on Earth, it actually is organized through lunar principles. So what we say is we need nobody to rule but the moon. The moon should become organizer of time. Somebody's got the wise wounds there in the chat. This is exactly it. As part of our evolution, the moon has been enormously important. It's influenced the length and periodicity of women's reproduction. And that means that women and children and men have been operating on schedules which are in relation to the moon. Now, this all may seem like, it's just, menstrual madness, or menstrual moonshine was something that some of our old SWP comrades used to say about it. But actually, this is part of our natural rhythms. And if we are going to link in ways that are really kind of, this is quite hard to say to Marxists, religious or sacred in aspect, we need to link in ways that are material and meaningful in terms of our Earth, Moon, Sun system. And so we think of, lunarchy as seizing. We think of it as like we're going on strike. We're going to go on strike at the dark of the moon in relation to women's blood. And we're going to go on strike until certain things have happened by the full of the moon, where our demands are met in terms of proper sharing. Our demands are met in terms of maintaining the rainforest. Our demands are met in terms of cleaning up the rivers. Our demands are met in terms of making sure that the sky, there isn't pollution in the sky or pollution in the city, whatever. So we need to establish that rhythm. But the point about the lunarchy model is that once the demand is met, let it go. let the capitalists and the bankers have their fun for a little while, as long as the next dark moon, you rise up again. You've got to keep that rhythm going. You've got to keep the uprising going. The moon is setting the rhythm. So, okay, that's as much as I'm going to say now. I'm sure it's crazy for Marxists, but we can have some questions.
Well, I mean, I'm a Marxist. I find it, I've heard it for a few years now. First time I heard it, boom, mind blown. And I imagine there'll be a few people in the audience who feel similar. So please click raise hand if you have a question or contribution. And there's a lot in it. And, you know, we'll put out the video and you'll be able to watch it later. A couple of questions, though, for you both, starting with Camilla. It is, I mean, you did mention this, you know, these and Chris as well, these communistic societies still exist in some places, but actually existed until the sort of 18th, 19th century in wide areas. I actually read Rosa Luxemburg after I read Chris talking about it in the Weekly Worker. Her introduction to national economy is fascinating on that aspect, better than Engels' description, I think, where she describes how colonialism goes around the world in the 17th, 18th century. And they find, oh, there's a strange setup there. Isn't it? How these people organize and they share everything. They held the land in common. That's just odd. Oh, this must be a Russian thing. And then they go to somewhere in Asia and they find the same thing. And then they go somewhere in Africa and they find the same thing all over the place. Of course, they're not interested in explaining that this is an international, or all these people have lived in egalitarian ways all over the world. They're not interested in that. It's up to people like Rosa Luxemburg and Engels to explain, no, this is actually how we have lived for the vast majority of our lives. Deeply inspiring, very, very, very interesting. I also liked your how you're describing, you know, the evidence, and there is evidence of collective childcare, of the brain size explosion. I think there's a really big, you know, how did that happen? Something must have happened clearly, and you know, especially if you have children, they do drain you incredibly. You know, it takes up all your time for the first 10 years or so if you have nobody else doing it with you. So this is the understanding that this comes from collective childcare is very interesting. The cooperative eyes, I'd say also, I'm not sure if I got this right, but menopause as well seems to be an evidence that, you know, at some stage women are not supposed to, you know, it makes no sense to reproduce anymore. You're supposed to help your children, and, you know, you can have sex, but you're not supposed to have children of your own anymore, but look after your kids. But in terms of, Chris described it then as matriarchy. And I wonder actually if this is right, because this has for me, you know, the patriarchy, we know there's men ruling. Was it, though, a matriarchy in the sense that it's women ruling? And egalitarianism sounds more like a matrilineal, perhaps. Is there a difference between the two? Is it matriarchy, matrilineal society, or are they actually the same thing in your view?
Yeah.
Well, can I just say, I've slightly changed my terminology. I used to not really like the term matriarchy for the reasons I think most people would agree. It looks like sort of patriarchy done by women in reverse. So, I mean, but on the other hand, since I've become more familiar with Jerome Lewis's and Morner's work, what actually does happen is that the women absolutely rule. I mean, with the Goku, I mean, you should just see the video of an example of the Goku. There's a whole bunch of about, I don't know, 35, 40 young girls and women emerging out of the forest, coming towards the men, strutting their stuff, hugely contemptuous and teasing of the men, sort of all sorts of very rude singing about, you know, the men's capacities and stuff. And they really intimidate the boys to an extent, but it's kind of playful, but it's absolutely no doubt about it. It's the rule of women, but women get, you know, they just say, okay, we made our point. So you get the rule of women. And then about a fortnight later, you get, quote, the rule of men. You get a jengi, which is, you know, another ritual. So we get this pendulum of power. So with neither gender seizing power for any extended period of time, it never becomes permanent. But of course, what does happen is that when finally men take over for various reasons to do with, you know, abundance of game and various things. Of course, when men take over, then they take over like for good, and then they have all these myths about the terrible the terrible threat that if the men let go of their dominance, then what's going to happen? There'll be this tyranny of women all over again. But this tyranny of women was sort of real, but playful. And I mean, there's no better medicine for Marxists who want to find out how it works than to just find that video. I mean, it's on Jerome's website, and you can easily get hold of it. It's called Ngoku, and it's about.
Find it now and share it if you want to, but yeah.
Yeah, we can email out those things as well.
Yeah. And I mean, the other point to say to your question, Tina, is the critical bit is matrilocal, really. It's the thing that a mum and a daughter, and indeed the mum may be becoming menopausal, and that's part of the grandmother hypothesis. The mum and a daughter are living together and sticking together. And that is the crucial thing for the allocare, collective childcare matrix, effectively. It means that, okay, the husband who's maybe doing some good work in providing he provides to the camp rather than to the household because it goes to everyone, but he's kept on his toes because the boss is his mother-in-law. She really is the boss, and he's on probation all the time. That he is, if he wants to stay married to that woman, he's got to do the business. He's got to be working and providing. And if he starts to throw his weight about, well, those women together, plus all the other women in the camp, will absolutely resist it. They have very good strategy and tactics for any kind of bullying or domestic violence. They will get it. And of course, that was in Engels originally when he was talking about the longhouse, quoting the missionaries on the longhouses of the Iroquois, that if the husband wouldn't shift, he was shiftless. Yeah, there's Chris can read it out.
This is
He'd have to pick up his blanket and budge.
Please let me just read this out. This is Engels on sex strike among the Iroquois. As to their family system, quoting from Lewis Henry Morgan, as to their family system, when occupying the old longhouses, communistic households comprising several families, as to them, it's probable that some one clan predominated, the women taking in husbands, however, from other clans. Usually, the female portion ruled the house. The stores were in common, but woe to the luckless husband or lover who was too shiftless to do his share of the providing. No matter how many children or whatever goods he might have in the house, he might at any time be ordered to pick up his blanket and budge. And after such orders, it would not be healthful for him to attempt to disobey. The house would be too hot for him, and he must retreat to his own clan. And then it says the women with a great power among the clans. So
it was a communist matriarchy.
When women live together, if you're living with your mum, you're going to be living with your sisters. Your mum's going to be living with her mum. You're going to have a whole clan, and you never have what we would call marriage, because the men never have permanent conjugal rights in a woman. They're always on probation. It's always if they're trying to sort of get married, but the actual marriage ceremony never happens, and so a man never has any conjugal rights. Even when he's quite old, he might settle down. He might be very fond of each other, the couple, of course, but the man never can say, right, this woman, you're mine. You said yes to me all those years ago. I can have sex with you because you're my wife. All that crap which came.
Well, they might let him go off and visit his folks some of the time.
Yes,
but
of course. Yeah.
Literally, for the Junquois Bushmen, a guy is doing bride service for like 10 years in his bride's camp before. So there's two or three kids walking before he will be able to take his wife away to another camp, really. So he's got to prove himself that way. Yeah. So that is a vital part of the system.
And even if she takes her to the other camp, she can always come home again if she gets fed up.
Oh, yeah. But people move around and they're always visiting, and it's always.
Okay, I thought it was matrilineal, but yeah, okay, that's worth looking into.
If you trace genetic lineage, there is this aspect that the maternal lines are localized for hunter-gatherers, particularly in Central Africa. This has been found in the genes, whereas the other way around for farmers have paternal lines localized, so they're patrilineal whereas hunter-gatherers will have this matrilineage.
Yeah.
Going
Can we
down.
talk about this actually? I mean, I know we can't talk about it long, and it would be a big subject. What happened basically? You know, how did it stop? How did all the crap begin? As Marx and Engels put it, is a big subject, the Neolithic Revolution. But you know, but perhaps we could explain it in a few short sentences. Why did we stop living like that? Were we too successful?
Well, you want to say something, Chris? I can say something, but
the point is, when you've got a large amount of game animals around, when men go hunting, they can be pretty sure they're going to come back with, you know, a zebra, a giraffe, you know, a wildebeest. You can be pretty sure there's so many animals out there that you can slow down your rhythm of hunting to a roughly once a month hunt. So you get a big collective hunt, and it makes a lot of sense to build up to the hunt around full moon, because then you've got all night to be able, you can still see what you're doing. If you choose to hunt around dark moon, the lions are out and they can see you, you can't see them, you probably get eaten. So it makes a huge amount of difference with all the lions around in Africa, whether the moon's out or not. So it makes a lot of sense to hunt this very slow rhythm. Now, the critical thing is what happens when the large game animals are being hunted to extinction, when, you know, like there's fewer and fewer of them around. Well, what happens is you have to speed up. So any animal, any small animal, could be just a rabbit or something. You're getting hungry. You haven't hunted anything for a while. You chase after it, and the point is, as the ancient slow rhythm of hunting, you know, production and consumption, really, really nice and slow and leisurely with confidence. As that begins to collapse and things get speeded up, what happens is that the periodicity of men's work gets out of sync with women's periodicity. And that means that women can no longer use their own solidarity and synchrony as the sort of clock guiding determining the rhythm of hunting. I mean, it's a lot more complex than that, because of course what also happens is that instead of women getting produce from men, increasingly men are going to be starting to get produce from women's gathering and small animal hunting, and everything starts to turn sort of topsy-turvy. So that when you've got a large game hunting economy, and you say you sort of notice, oh, they seem to be monogamous. It's not really because they've got monogamy. It's because one man has quite a job keeping one woman happy, but keeping 3 or 4 women happy is kind of allowed. But how do you do it? How can one man hunt enough to keep one woman happy? But when the arrows of production and circulation get reversed, and instead of men having to keep women provided, it's men are actually relying on women's labour to provide for them, as happens in parts of Aboriginal Australia, the Tiwi Island, for example. Well, you know, a man with 3 wives is going to be better off than a man with wife. And so suddenly you get a complete shift into one man benefiting from having more than one wife. Then, of course, some men don't have any wives at all, and you're on the road towards the hierarchy and all the sort of, as you said, the crap. So it's partly about periodicity.
But also about scarcity, and in that there was no
scarcity and periodicity are linked. Yeah.
It should be kind of emphasized. I mean, there are almost surely very many different pathways to the beginnings of some form of gender hierarchy, and gender hierarchy would have been the beginning of the breakdown. And this would have happened in many different ways in different parts of the world. And it would have begun also, it wouldn't just have waited for farming, because as soon as there are issues of scarcity for hunting peoples, it might become the issue was who was in control or was able to take power in terms of ritual power, and women's ritual power, which in Mourner's Communism in Motion model is kind of in a very equal power with men's. In Africa, in African hunter-gatherers, that has been maintained to a considerable degree. But in Australia, for instance, Aboriginal traditions, which are very, very ancient traditions, virtually in the same levels of antiquity as the African, there is much more scarcity in the Australian conditions compared to African big game hunting conditions. And men have taken over the job of performing ritual using the same kind of language of blood that women used the red ochre and the blood signals that they used in Africa. And the Aboriginal Australians are doing that, but men are doing it. So literally we have systems where men use the signals of menstruation, and they may render that very secret, that initiation very secret, and exclude women from that situation. So it's possible to see the hierarchy coming in even before we get to a situation of farming and property. But it will already begin to pay men in the systems of kind of old gerontocracy, old men's rule in Australia, for a man to have more than one wife. Because if the woman is doing the work, and he can have more wives, and he's better off. And also, those older men are able to manipulate the labor of young men, because if they can control and make decisions about who can marry who's able to. So this is critical. Who is in control of ritual? Who is in control of decisions about marriage in the kinship system is very critical.
I think it's really important to locate scarcity as the reason it collapsed, which also leads to, of course, the need for communism on a higher level. We need to have abundance. We have to be really clear that, something like Soviet Union, which if it can't go international, if you can't have, a lot of everything and everybody can have what they want and what they need, really, it's doomed to failure. So we have to have abundance in our kind of communism of the future, which will be quite different, I think, to what we had in the past, although it will be inspired by it and the solidarity, etc., that you described. But certainly the possibility to have abundance must be at the heart of communism. That I think that informs that. So thank you very much. We've got a couple of people with their hands up already. If anybody else would like to ask a question or make a contribution, please click raise hand or put it in the chat if you can't find that button, and I'll bring you in. Malcolm first.
Okay. I feel a bit of a fraud, actually, because I arrived a bit late, so you might have already done what I was going to ask you. But there was two things that impressed me quite a long time ago. One was a statement in the book by John Kerry, it wasn't his, that we're all born with Stone Age brains. This made me think quite a lot. And the other one was the Jared Diamond essay of Man's Biggest Mistake. He claims farming, so after farming everything went wrong. And I've tried to find recently anybody sort of pointing out that Jared Diamond was completely wrong and didn't know what he's talking about. And I couldn't really find anything that actually opposed his idea. So I think that probably he's not correct, because I think when Professor Knight was talking about the availability of game, I think before people did farming, they actually made things like the mammoth extinct, etc. So there was I think when they got to America or they got to Australia, there were large, slow, friendly animals who they just made extinct. So I don't quite know how all that works, really. But the other thing that always impressed me was cultural universals. I thought that was a very interesting idea. I think it's Don Brown, isn't it? So all these things sort of like mushed around in my mind, trying to think how it might be and how it could be, obviously, because if you're, I don't know whether I'm a communist or a Marxist or what, but as you're trying to look to some future which is better than what you've got at the moment, you have to try and think, how would it be or where did it come from? So I'm not asking a very clever question, I must say. It seems a bit bits and pieces. But I mean, is the Jared Diamond idea at all correct? I mean, could I ask you? That would be my question.
Chris, do you want to say, or shall I say a little bit?
Yeah, go on.
So there's been a lot of discussion and argument about Jared Diamond, and there's also Against the Grain of James C. Scott. And some of that has focused on, it really makes a difference what particular grains, and can you store those grains so that it's possible for certain people to manipulate and control food sources. if the grains can't be stored readily and that they're going to be distributed much more widely, but if some people, for instance, wheat is something that can really be stored in very large grain bins and then can be potentially controlled and can lead to systems of dependency. But other grains like millet and teff and which so you will tend to get a much lesser degree of stratification in areas. I mean, Africa is generally far less stratified area than the whole of Eurasia in general. So yeah, that there's that aspect of the thesis. There've been people like David Graeber and Wengrow completely attacking the notion that farming inevitably means inegalitarianism, and trying to say, oh, there was lots of egalitarianism going with the early farmers and early cities as well before the worst set in. So there is a lot of discussion about it. Chris, do you want to add anything?
Just on the point about many early cities being really egalitarian, I mean, they're right. There's no question that some of the early cities, there's no question from the architecture. You can see all the houses look very, very similar size, and there's no great big, men's house, but there will be a religious house. So, I mean, they're quite right, Graeber and Wengrow, to talk about the enormous variety of ways in which you can move to farming. But just one other point, Malcolm. In my book, Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture, towards the end, I deal with exactly the point you're making about the mammoths and the giant camels and the sloths. There's no question that over a very long period, what happened with our communistic big game hunters, yes, it does. It very much. Some people say, "Oh, you shouldn't say that about indigenous people or something," but I just don't agree with that. It seems to be pretty obvious that if you're hunters and gatherers, you're going to target the largest animals. You're going to target the mammoths. You're going to target the giant camels. You're going to target in Australia. They had a thing called a diprotodon, a huge sort of marsupial, which is the size of a rhinoceros, and you choose the big one, and because you've got enough meat to last a month at least. And of course, if they kill the female, it does a huge damage to the herd. So to me, it's not a coincidence that those very large animals, we call them the megafauna, they all one over the other in Australia, in North America, and South America. These very large animals went extinct. There's one continent in which they didn't go extinct, and that was Africa, where you still have megafauna. We have its amazing, unbelievable creatures. I mean, just imagine a thing with a huge long trunk the size of an elephant or a giraffe. These are huge megafauna, which are still there because the large game animals sort of got the hang of humans, and they weren't taken by surprise, and they co-evolved with us. So that's why communism survived longer in Africa than elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, could
Rob,
I just...
please. Sorry, we have to move on. Rob, please.
Hello. I'd just like to start out. We did a talk on this a while ago, Tina, looking at eco-communism and kind of the basis, and I kind of took a different tack to you. So I'm going to bring some of those issues up. I've kind of been reading the history of everything by Graeber and Wengrow recently, and I would say that I agree with you. I think that the kind of female kin bonds hypothesis for the development of brain size is compelling. I think there's definitely something strong in that, and it's really good to see the evidence, because Tina was talking about it must be about 10 months ago now or something like that, and it's nice to see the kind of graphs and things that actually demonstrate the charted progression. But what I would say is Malcolm kind of brought it up and Camilla kind of answered it, is that they're kind of thinking about communism as a necessary early step in human development, and kind of takes away a little bit from human political agency in a sense. So I kind of agree with Graeber and Wengrow that there's a plasticity in human societies in the early foundations, that once you're aware of political ideas, you start to experiment with different political ideas, and these can take different shapes and forms that are infinitely varied depending on what part of depending on the conditions, depending on any number of external circumstances. Even something like charisma could be a factor in maybe switching between from the kind of matrilocal power movement to a patrilineal one, you know, that one person was particularly persuasive in a dispute with neighboring groups, and then this kind of changes the nature of these groups. You kind of answered it though, because you said, you know, because we spoke about civilizations and early civilizations like Ur and Uruk, where you can see that there's, you know, a huge amount of these kind of uniform housing, and there must have been therefore uniform kind of allocation of grain in order to kind of function in these environments, so that civilization isn't a necessary step to kind of hierarchy that we might assume. And I think, you know, again, Graeber and Wengrow talk about lots of early civilizations that are doing this kind of thing, and that, you know, he talks even about, you know, the Olmec in South America being overthrown potentially by revolution, and the Mayans also suffering from a similar sort of fate, that they once lived in civilization and regressed. And there's this plasticity, which then leads me to the question of, you know, where do the panelists stand with kind of stages? And because I know Engels is very much, you know, we went from A to B to C to D, and then the natural conclusion of that is communism. Would you disagree with that, Camilla? That's not how you.
No, I mean, the evolutionary anthropologists, Darwinians, are just not going to use stagist ideas, because there are so many pathways.
Mm-hmm.
What I was trying to say, Graeber and Wengrow are wrong. Egalitarianism was what made us human.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here as language speaking, all singing, all dancing, ritual, artistic human beings, except for that filter of egalitarianism.
Mm.
Once we hit situations like Tina's saying of scarcity of in different climates, in different environments, and all kinds of different things could happen. Gender was always the thing that was going to change. It's always the pivot. It's always the weak point. That's where it's going to happen first. But it can happen in lots and lots of different ways, for sure. We are those hunters. Just Marxists, get rid of this idea. There's this some development in technology that changes us from those hunter-gatherers are us and we are them. Our brains, our hearts, our minds, our souls, we are them.
Yeah.
So we've got everything they've got, and they've got everything we've got.
I fully agree with what you're saying, because, you know, quite a lot of Marxists on the left kind of take it that it's an inevitability that we're going to end up at communism, because that's the way we progressed, that we've gone through these stages and we've moved from here to there. I would disagree with that personally. I think that it's much more plastic. There's much more plasticity there.
Yeah, in that sense, Graeber and Wengrow must be right, and they demonstrate so much variability. But when Wengrow gets up and starts banging away about this myth must die, we were never, you know, the idea we were always equal. The worst bit is that they really talk about these egalitarian hunter-gatherers being simple and childlike, or if you say they're egalitarian, that means simple and childlike. There is nothing more sophisticated politically than egalitarianism, than doing egalitarianism every day and maintaining those relationships with people every day. Nobody is there keeping the law, putting anyone in prison, doing, you know, how do you deal with violence? How do you deal with, you do it through your alliances, through your people at your back, through having the relationships, through using ritual, through using laughter. There's all these sophisticated techniques. So we're quite cross with Graeber and Wengrow, the way they've kind of rubbished egalitarian hunter-gatherers.
Especially when they say that hunter-gatherers are simple because they don't produce a surplus. There's no surplus. And if you don't have a surplus, you can't have complexity. And this idea is just so rubbish. I mean, and it does plays into the idea that you mentioned, Tina, earlier, that, you know, we just think of hunters and gatherers somehow they don't have a surplus, therefore they're impoverished in some way. I'm sorry, there's the point about the surplus is that they're enjoying the surplus. I mean, it's the term superabundance fits very well. And Jerome Lewis just says, if you mention to the Bayaka, the people he's been with for whatever, you know, 20, 25 years, say that some places in the world people starve. They say, "Ah, come on, you're joking." It's some parts of the world there's not enough air around. I mean, they just say, come on, pull the other one. I can't believe it, because starvation isn't a concept they have.
The idea that there would be children in this incredibly rich country going to bed without or hardly having anything to eat all day. And a hunter-gatherer camp is like a machine of collective childcare. Doesn't matter who you are, what child you are, every child is going to get fed. It's just unthinkable.
And also, just one other thing. I mean, a rather important need we all have is for joy. It sounds odd to say that, but Jerome just says most of the things that Bengeli do, most of their techniques of singing and dancing and ritual and so on are part of what he calls a technology of joy. And every time they get, first of all, you know, whenever you go near a hunter-gatherer camp, and Camilla and I have got experience of this with the hunter, the thing you hear from quite a distance away is everyone seems to be singing. But Jerome just says that, you know, when they're Bengeli involved in their singing, they just reach a point where it's just absolute joyful communitas are coming together, and they thirst for this moment of joy. And then as soon as they start to fall a little bit out of sync with it, they go, stop it all, stop it all, stop it all. And then they start another again, and they really have this thirst for joy. I'm just thinking how often in the West, in London and places, do we have, you know, communal joy? I mean, sometimes on a carnival, Notting Hill Carnival gets there pretty near, I would say, and lots of other times, of course. Sometimes on a picket line, if you start having a really good time on the picket line with a lot of dancing and music, it can happen. But how often do we get joy, and you know, out in the community, and not enough, I would have thought.
My only concern, sorry Tina, I know I'm probably overrunning, but my only concern with this angle of, you know, the hunter-gatherer society is always, you know, it's full of joy, and there's all these communal elements. You know, I am a communist. I do believe in a communal society. I do think these things will be celebrated more in our society, but I don't necessarily believe that all hunter-gatherer societies will conform to that cultural norm. And when I did my paper, I looked at some.
We're not saying that. We're saying particular hunter-gatherer societies. This is what Grabe and Wengrow talk a lot about what are called complex hunter-gatherer societies, which are stratified because there's much denser population, there is labor exploitation, potential slavery. They create, you know, they're not immediate return, they're delayed return, where there can be complex interdependencies and some people in charge or with greater able to order about other people. They're not all like that. I actually said that there are hunter-gatherers in Australia, in Aboriginal Australia, where gender hierarchy is the first thing that gets really installed. There is control over labor, there's control over marriage. Yeah, so that is where it starts.
Just really briefly, it's quite important to say that say the northwest coast of North America, the Kwakiutl and all those people with totems, they had nobles, commoners, slaves. They show how many slaves they have. They'd even killed slaves at a potlatch to show how wealthy they were. I mean, when that sort of thing happened, it wasn't because hunter-gatherers got bored with communism and decided, oh, let's try something else. Let's try a bit of despotism. That's the image, I'm afraid, which in the dawn of everything you have. It's not materialistic, and they have this idea that our ancestors were imaginative, politically creative, and constantly building up a social system in order to have the joy of treading it all down again. And it's as if it's all a matter of will. The reason why, there are very material reasons why the Kwakiutl and those people up in that northwest coast became hierarchical. It's to do with the salmon and the storage of the salmon, the need to store food and all those things. So, you know, let's get back to some basic Marxist materialism.
Yes.
So, Rob, did you actually ask the question you wanted to ask, or you've got something?
Yeah, so well, my first question was going to be, where do panelists stand on stagism? You know, and I think we've kind of answered that. My second question was going to be, is it necessary for Marxists to base their political beliefs in anthropology?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is because
it's the most materialist thing to do, because there's real people, real societies who've performed all these different experiments. So we've got to find out about them.
If you look at humans without looking at all humans, past, present, future, and all over the world, doing something called sociology or psychology or some bloody thing, you're not asking the fundamental question: what does it mean to be human? Now, that was what Marx and Engels were interested in. That's, what does it mean to be human? It's a very broad question. It's a very simple question, a very broad question, but it's the most beautifully interesting, vital question of all. So, of course, Marx and Engels were anthropologists. Of course, that's what they were. Yes.
I would argue that there's a slight distinction between the views of Marx and the views of Engels on this.
Yeah.
I think Marx is a bit more flexible in kind of in it, but I am a Marxist. I do believe in communism. I just don't necessarily. I have a kind of pluralistic view of early human societies, and I do think there was communistic elements that we can emulate and that we can kind of look to, but I don't necessarily believe that it is the essential human condition. Although I do find Camilla's scientific evidence on mother kinship to be quite compelling. I might
move on.
I'll move on. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I mean, I think we've answered it. I mean, personally, I'm not an anthropologist. I just find it really, really inspiring, and it sort of blew my mind when I first heard it, and it kind of shows, we've done it before, and that sort of gives me hope that we can do it again. That from that basic level, it works for me, and there'll probably be other people saying it does nothing for me, but we're all different, but it works. It certainly works for me. And of course, there are differences. I mean, when we look at, you described very well how the girls, they tease, they tease and they laugh and stuff, and that's how they stop basically hierarchy establishing itself. Of course, and there's a couple of things in the chat on that. From today's position, we're gonna have to do a bit more than just laugh and do two fingers up to our opposition. There will be a period, presumably, unless we are 99.9%, where there will be a more than laughing. Let's put it like that, and where we might have to take violent measures. But in the future, when we're talking about the revolution being permanent, I think that's where this comes into it again. And we have to constantly renew communism. Everything that is born dies, and to prevent communism dying, we have to renew it all the time, don't we? And so we can. That's when what we've learned from the past can come into play again, I think. We've got two more speakers who want to ask questions. Sorry for rushing things along a bit. I mean, it's a fascinating subject. I could go on all night, but we're trying not to. Ian.
Good evening, comrades. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I wanted to move things along from joy to a bit of misery. My sort of personal motivation is I'm a mental health nurse by trade, and I wanted to really ask you about the kind of evolutionary basis of empathy. Because looking at Marx and Engels' writings, we do see a sense of an essential human nature, which is social and by implication empathetic. And my experience of most of humanity is of great empathy. And indeed, most of my colleagues I've worked with over the years have chosen their occupation because of empathy and what it is that makes us truly human, and not just humans, by the way. I mean, lots of other animals show signs of empathy too. And also, there's this whole fascinating evolutionary history of the development of the frontal lobes, which control empathy. But I've also worked, of course, with people who lack empathy, and they have no conscience, and they can do the most heinous things. And I think quite properly are regarded as being unwell rather than just being simply evil. The fascinating thing in recent years is the development of positron emission tomography, which you can actually see the inactivity of frontal lobes in people who have developed personality disorders, for example. Now, one argument from people like, less so from Robert Sapolsky, but definitely from James Fallon, is the idea that losing empathy, not having empathy, is an evolutionary adaptation to a heinous world, which is intriguing. So the idea, for example, that in a brutal society, it actually does you good to lose your capacity for empathy. And from that point of view, one can see an interrelationship between class society and the development of serious mental illness. I have no qualms about the term mental illness, by the way. But I'm not here, by the way, saying that capitalism is responsible for mental illness or whatever, or human alienation is the one sole basis for mental illness. But I do see an important connection there about the idea that depression, anxiety, and a whole range of other things are a response to stresses and strains which would not have existed in a non-class society. The wish to lose one's empathy as an adaptive development, I can't imagine being a feature of any non-class society. I wonder whether there is, just as the question is, drawing upon your extensive experience of anthropology, can you think of any kind of society which has in any way lost empathy?
Interesting question. Who wants to take it if you know anything about it? I mean, it's not sure if it's your expertise.
Luckily, Darwinism has a measure of what's called fitness, and it's kind of, it sounds a bit brutal, but it's getting your genes into the future. Having no empathy under any circumstances, unless you, I don't know, I suppose you can imagine a sort of multiple rapist getting some of his genes in the future, but I don't even think that's going to work, because somehow those kids, if they are kids, have got to live in a world which means they can actually grow up and have children themselves. I mean, it's no, I mean, empathy can in the case of human evolution, there can never have been a period when there was selection for loss of any kind of empathy. But I mean, you're right, Ian. I mean, it's you're certainly. I was very touched with that wonderful film, Chimp Empire, of chimpanzees engaged in warfare with each other, but within each group, within the two communities, there was a huge amount of very touching mutual support, empathy. When one of the chimps was coming back wounded and injured, all his comrades would come around him and pat his back and console him. When one of them was dying of wounds, they would all, you know, even though they'd been enemies, they would come up. These two enemies would, you know, the loser of the fight sort of forgave everything, and there's a huge amount of empathy, if you like, in the animal world. So. I mean, I don't think that's controversial, and of course, you know, loss of empathy is going to be a pathology which has almost certainly got you know, origins in abuse of one sort or another.
I do want to point out as well, of course, that the people who are in that position, who have lost empathy, suffer terrible pains precisely because they lose their capacity for sociality.
Yeah, no one wants to be friends with somebody like that.
No, and it was why it was a fascinating area of specialism for me as a nurse. You know, they're not people who attract a great deal of sympathy, but they do suffer enormously. And you look at the self-harm and the mutilation and all the rest of it. But I'm not asking for you know, is there? I think what I find fascinating is not just evolution, but sort of epigenetics, as it were, the way in which actually relatively rapid changes can take place on the basis of social conditions. And I think this is fascinating from a dialectical point of view, and it's fascinating because it opens up the possibility of real change very quickly, in fact, in human society. I'm not suggesting all ills will be cured within a few months of the revolution or whatever, but it does make a huge difference. There are, of course, societies which have been brutally competitive because they've had to be. And from that point of view, can we draw any conclusions from that?
There's a book called the what is it called, the Mountain People, Colin Turnbull, the people called the Eek. It's a shocking, terrible story of what happened.
Yes, but there is a lot of exaggeration with this book. I mean, the reliability of this book is rather dubious. It was an extraordinary situation of famine and which has been made into this fable of comparative. Colin Turnbull did work with the Mbuti and then with the Eek, and the Mbuti had this incredible sharing, exactly egalitarian hunter-gatherers, and then the Eek were who were pretty, very close by people, were in a situation of desperate starvation and illness, and so they were held up as falling into a state of total apathy and lack of empathy. But it was a very
sensationalized. It was sensationalized.
Sensationalized, and it's been reanalyzed by Catherine Townsend and Lee Cronk as, that we can't hold that up as an alternative. Well, I was going to point you would be, if you looked at, for the work, in fact, if you looked at the website called The Evolved Nest by Darshan Avais, I've put in the chat, and Darsha's work as a psychologist, neuroscience, she's absolutely worked on the feedback systems of child development in relation, so it's epigenetics plus child development, that feeds into what happens to a child if the child is given the love that is required for development, or if the child does not receive that. There is a huge difference in outcomes in the way that the child is positioned to face the world, of course, and that will have an enormous impact. But one other thing to say, because I couldn't say everything in that very brief discussion on our evolution in relation to egalitarianism, female ancestors were choosing men, particularly, with much reduced reactive aggression. This is called a process of self-domestication, that a species domesticates itself by inhibiting reactive aggression, and therefore that would enable far more room to emotions of empathy and enabling into subjectivity and being able to, create social relationships on much more of a basis of prosociality. And this is becoming strongly argued nowadays, that was the pathway towards modern humans, possibly a difference between us and Neanderthals in the levels to which reactive aggression was brought.
Was that Sapiens was less aggressive than Neanderthal?
Reactive aggression, able to inhibit. That does not mean there is no aggression. It means inhibiting reaction, fast reaction to without thought.
It means you can be aggressive, but you think about it. You think about it.
You're going to meditate. You're going to consider the options. You're going to think about: have I got allies? Have I,
Which is also
a different story.
Which is also, of course, a feature of the frontal lobes.
Have we got a question for Rowan?
That's absolutely social.
Well, I guess I raised my hand. I was just on the primitive communism topic. I tend to believe it's a spectrum, and that even modern capitalist societies have communistic elements. And so, but by the same token, a lot of the early communistic societies, you could say, had capitalist or hierarchical elements, and but I think often there's such a tendency to see the worst in all other societies and in hunter-gatherer societies. But also I think the primitive communism also persisted in a lot of agricultural societies or semi-agricultural societies. Like throughout the Americas, the concepts of property were very, very different from what they were in Europe, what they were in the Middle East, and etc. So I just think that there is a lot to be said for at least property relations being a lot more communistic on the spectrum than they are at present in almost every society anywhere.
I would fight against too much of this pluralism, really. So in Africa, there's no doubt, you're no doubt right. And many of those hominin groups would have been quite internally competitive, maybe quite a bit of male dominance, all sorts of things going on. But it's just that those wouldn't have been our ancestors, because those would have been on the road to extinction, simply because, you know, as Camilla has been explaining, unless you have hugely powerful systems of mutual childcare, those large brain babies wouldn't be affordable. And what you'd get actually under conditions where, supposing one of the, if you had this pluralism, all sorts of different ways of being primitive communists, those where, you know, those where the poor little kids had to grow up quickly, those where the women, you know, would do better off by having a smaller brain baby than a bigger one, because she wasn't
wouldn't have language. I mean, just
so,
straight, they wouldn't have got language, so they wouldn't be our ancestors.
The peculiar uniformity about the genetics of all members of Homo sapiens right across the planet. We're as closely related to each other in mitochondrial DNA as two groups of gorillas on opposite sides. So it's just showing that we've all come from a very small population. What's going on there? There was what's called a bottleneck. I mean, there's all sorts of different arguments about how big this bottleneck. Well, it's probably
the bottleneck is for Eurasians, not for people inside Africa, though.
Yes, okay, but I mean, right, yes, of course, but of course there was also dispersal within Africa, and all of us, including Africa, obviously there's greater genetic diversity within Africa than among populations that got out of Africa. But despite that, any member of our species, any two members of Homo sapiens picked from any part of the planet, are astonishingly genetically similar. That's just a fact. Much more similar than two groups of mountain gorillas or chimpanzees or even bonobos, actually, because that's just showing we've been evolving for a much shorter period of time, which also indicates, of course, that we're a very recent species. So it must have been a small population, and that small population wouldn't have been pluralistic in the sense. You wouldn't have had all kinds of different ways of doing things. You had a successful way and lots of much less successful ways which were moving towards extinction.
Thanks, Rowan.
A lot of our genetic diversity or distinctiveness at this time is actually defined by our different admixture with different, you know, so-called archaic hominins. You know, that there's different parts of the human population which will have more Denisovan or more Neanderthal or more African.
1% of genes.
African genetics has the genetics of African hunter-gatherers has massively most diversity,
right,
compared to everywhere else, the rest of Africa, and then there's a teeny weeny bit for the rest of the world with the archaics chucked in.
Well, the Africans have archaic, you know, especially Khoisan populations have an archaic, one or two archaic ancestors, and even most Africans have Neanderthal DNA.
It's not quite clear.
Okay, we've got to move on now, comrades. Sorry, we've got one more question from the floor, and it's already 10 to 9. Sorry, Rowan. Thanks for coming along. Paul, your camera doesn't work, I think.
No, sorry about that. Just thanks to both of you. I've really enjoyed the talk and the subsequent discussion. I've just got a couple of points to make. One was that people have talked about, like, there's aspects of the future communist society within capitalism, and it's almost as if, as well as we talk about communism in motion, we've got hierarchy in motion. And it's been like hierarchical societies have always had to try to keep sort of communistic tendencies that always seem to emerge. They've got to keep them down. You've got the witch trials, stuff happening with Thomas Munster, the Peasants' Revolt, and these themes seem to constantly repeat themselves. And I've noticed as well that in some communities where things have gone bad, you know, there's a lot of poverty and all the rest of it, there's almost a kind of, you see some of these things where, like, you've got that where you're talking about family kinship, where mothers and daughters run things, and you've got almost like emergency matrilocal tendencies evolve, if that makes any sense. Obviously not without the sort of political solidarity. It's like out of a reactive necessity and so on. And I was also going to ask a question about the left.
Well, I didn't
You
understand
know,
what was that question? I didn't hear a question there.
no, it was a point. Like
Emergence of local.
You know, sometimes you get these tendencies. They exist within us anyway, within society, within us as human beings. Even in a non-egalitarian society, these tendencies come out, and you have almost a hierarchy in motion where our communistic impulses have to be constantly kept down. So, like I say, it's this thing we have to constantly practice. And as communists and socialists, our movements are often not particularly egalitarian themselves, you know, and they're very hierarchical often. And I wonder what we could be doing and thinking about changing some of our practice, because you know how we act informs how we think. And I think, like in the 1970s, for example, you seem to at a point where the labor movement at its strongest, yada yada yada. You had lots of these tendencies for women's liberation and gay liberation, and people trying to live differently and take on board some of these motives, and that seems to have like evolved or mutated negatively into kind of identity politics, because it's a powerful movement's taken on by the ruling class, and it sort of mediated in their interests, if that makes sense. So what can we do now? I mean, like you know, I've just like comment on that without me rambling on much further. But thanks anyway. It's a great talk. Got a lot from it.
This would be a good question, I think, to sum up with as well for both of you, if you can. Maybe first Camilla and then Chris.
Okay. Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Paul, because yeah, there's been this kind of constant push and shove between those who would try to seize some sort of hierarchical control and then the resistance, because it's just in our nature to resist that kind of and it's in our nature to create solidarity, alliances, and human consciousness stemming from effectively from picket lines and solidarity. That is where our whole imagination took power, and where the entirety of symbolic culture, language, ritual, religion, everything comes from. So we must not and cannot forget or lose faith. I mean, just look today at the way the students across the US and students here in Europe too, and are rising up, and the forces of fascism are trying to squash them down. But as soon as those forces, those reincarnations of communism rise up, people are living in communistic horizontal environments. They're living in ways that would be recognizable to hunter-gatherers, with nobody taking charge, with autonomy, I mean, the only thing that those camps don't have is actual systems of childcare, which are, you know, obviously part and parcel of hunter-gatherer camps. They're the key, the mainstay of hunter-gatherer camps. So yeah, we've got to have faith in the future, that we will have the right instincts to create that future, and we should not lose hope of that. We do have the right instincts. Somebody in the chat was talking about the asylum seeker bus getting picketed out today. It was such a triumph. You know,
victory. Yeah. So just backing up what Camilla said, I mean, when I've been with David Graeber, actually, and many other anarchists, as well as communists, of course, and socialists and environmentalists in big camps up in Gleneagles and places, a huge lot of us all there, I just felt, oh, yeah, hunter-gatherers, you know, a huge effort to be not hogging the stage, not grandstanding, not being a big leader, you know, keeping everyone down, but making sure that all decisions are sort of consensual. You don't have votes. You just try to feel your way towards some kind of what are we going to do next? And also, above all, perhaps the most important materialist condition of intelligence is practice is primary. Don't have too many arguments about what ideology you've got. That's what are we going to do? What's the next move? You know, that's the critical thing. Focus on that, focus on that, focus on that. And as we feel that we're starting to move together and it's beginning to earn rewards, we're getting somewhere. It's astonishing how much the sort of ideological differences begin to pale in significance, and we find, and you don't have to teach people how to think. I can't stand the idea of sort of these various Marxist, I don't know, I won't mention names of various organizations. We just think the most important reason for having a newspaper is to tell people what kind of thoughts they should have. The critical thing is action, as solidarity in action, because without solidarity in action, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's probably enough.
That's opened up a whole can of worms there, hasn't it? Shall we talk about voting and democratic structure and consensus versus?
They have their place.
That's a different issue.
Don't impose them on one of these great student occupations and tell them that it can be centralized.
That probably would be inappropriate. I quite agree. But we are also talking about the working class becoming a party, and in order to take on the state, we kind of need to get organized. Let's not do that at 5 to 9.
Couldn't agree more anyway. I'm with you, Freya, from the very, very beginning. We need a revolutionary party.
Indeed.
Party of revolutionary science, of course. Yeah.
Yes, but in our communist practice, down the line, we would probably not do the voting and stuff, and hopefully could come to better arrangements, etc. But thank you very much. That was a really great discussion. I'm so glad we invited you for our one day late May Day celebration. I think it's a very inspiring project and a very fantastic work you're doing. So if you could put some links together for us as well, that'd be brilliant. If I could send them out to our list of about 1,000 people now, and I'm sure they would be very interested to read more about this. Thank you both. Next week we're talking about ABC of Marxism. Might want to come along to it or not, but that's an interesting subject as well. Comrades, good night.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Great. Thanks everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.